Hello and welcome to the training on Student Voice Basics, or as we like to call it, Student Voice 101. The audio today is by myself, Allison Baptiste. I am a staff member of the Kern County Foster Youth Services and Homeless Education Coordinating Program, which is a program of Kern County Superintendent of Schools. Today, what we're going to be discussing is all basics of Student Voice. If you have never heard of Student Voice or you just want to learn the basics, this is the training for you. However, if you go on the www.kern.org/HIP website, you can see more detailed trainings on specific elements of Student Voice. So first, we're going to talk about what is student voice and also how to avoid tokenism when dealing with student voice initiatives. So what is student voice? Student voice is the practice of educators intentionally, purposefully, and systematically eliciting student viewpoints on a specific topic for improvement purposes. This is very, very important. The three words, which are highlighted in black, intentionally, purposefully, and systematically, are the most important parts of the student voice definition. We like to use student voice and youth voice interchangeably, but they really don't mean the same thing. Student voice means that educators are being intentional and purposeful in order to receive student feedback to make systematic change. Student voice is not simply asking a student, how is your day today? Or what things do you like? What things do you not like? It's being intentional and purposeful about receiving that feedback and then using that feedback to make systemic change. So here's 5 important elements of student voice. You can use student voice in the classroom, but we really want to see it on a systematic level. We want the school administration to be looking at it. We want the district administration to be looking at it. So you can see that 5 different elements of student voice are as follows. Number 1, if you're going to use student voice in the classroom, then topics in the classroom should be relevant to students. Ask students what's relevant to them. Number 2, students have to have ongoing discussions with adults. In order for student voice to really be looked at and taken seriously and be used for systemic change, it's not a one-time discussion, it's an ongoing discussion with adults in charge. Number 3, students are involved in school and district planning and decisions. This is where the systemic effort starts to come into play. It's more than just asking a student how things are. It's actually involving them in school and district planning and decisions. Number 4, which is very, very difficult for many of us, is to actually share the power between students and adults on school and district levels. Student voice means that students and adults are working together to make systemic change. That means that you do have to allow a student to speak on behalf of their ideas and share some of that power with them. And then number 5, students are involved in the actions to address school improvement on school and district levels, which goes right alongside with number 4. Now, I like this quote by San Diego State University educational leadership professors Nancy Frey and Douglas Fisher, because it talks about how important it is to just let students speak. So their quote is, "The amount of talk that students do is correlated with their achievement. When students aren't asked to talk and think, well-meaning teachers fill the time with their own speaking." I want you to take a minute and reflect on that. Again, the amount of talk that students do is correlated with their achievement. When students are not asked to talk and think, then well-meaning teachers fill the time with their own speaking. We have to put ourselves in the uncomfortable and allow our students to speak on behalf of their own voices so that we know what their needs are and so that we can make changes that can help them have academic achievement. Oftentimes, we get really uncomfortable in silence. So we'll continue to speak as adults or educators. But we need to be uncomfortable in that silence and allow our students to be able to speak to us, and we need to be in a place to hear them. Now, it's very important to make sure that if we're discussing student voice, we also discuss tokenism. Tokenism is very unfortunate because oftentimes adults have the best of intentions when they ask students or young people to speak or to talk publicly, etc. But sometimes we will fall into the pitfall of tokenism. So I'm going to read this quote here by Adam F.C. Fletcher, and Adam Fletcher does do a lot of research and studies on student voice initiatives. And what Adam Fletcher says is the following: with the increased interest in student voice, which is any expression of students about learning, schools, or education, tokenism is bound to happen. Tokenism happens whenever students are in formal and informal roles, only to say that they have a voice instead of purpose, power, and possibility. Without that substance, student voice is little more than a loud whisper into a vacuum. Tokenism actually reinforces adultism by demonstrating adult power and highlighting young people's quote-unquote inability to do work of substance. So again, what's most important about this quotation is the definition of tokenism. Oftentimes what happens is we'll invite students or young people to speak with us, maybe at a conference or a training, or even to do a focus group. And oftentimes what ends up happening, unfortunately, is it's to check a box. It's to say, see, we did incorporate youth voice. We have them here. We took into account what they had to say. Done, check. But that is not truly incorporating student voice. That can fall under the pitfall of tokenism, because that's only to say that they have a voice. You're not actually giving the students purpose, power, and possibility. For student voice to work and for systemic change to happen, you have to allow students and adults to share some of the power within decision making. It's uncomfortable and it takes a lot of work, but it's important. If we don't truly take what students say and make systemic change with it, then all we're doing is simply trying to check a box to say that we listened to a student, even though we weren't actually going to use any of their ideas to make systemic change. So this is another great quote by a student named Lupe Navarro, who's a student leader in Eastside Union High School District in San Jose. And Eastside Union High School District has done a lot of student voice work. And a little bit later, we'll watch a short video about some great student voice work that they've done alongside UCLA. But Lupe says the following: when you have student voice, you have voices from people who are experiencing education firsthand. The problem is not whether you have their voices or not, but whether you listen and value their voices enough to really consider and act on what they're saying. If you don't, now you've made it worse. So what Lupe is essentially trying to say is, if you're going to ask a student for their feedback or listen to their voice, and you don't actually utilize what they say to make any kind of change, it was worse that you even asked them to begin with. You should have just left them alone. Because what ends up happening is when you ask students for their opinions and their feedback, they start to believe that something's going to happen. And when you don't actually utilize that feedback, then they feel let down by the school system. For our homeless students, this is very, very important, because many of them already feel as though they don't have control over any aspect of their lives, including their school futures. So when you ask them for feedback on things that should change to improve school for themselves, and you don't utilize any of what they say, they're not only going to lose more trust in the school system than they originally had, but they're not going to provide feedback to you again in the future. You have to listen and value their voices enough to really consider and act on what they're saying. Now, what we need to talk about as well is how student voice does not mean that students just get to do whatever they please. Student voice does mean collaboration. So again, student voice does not mean that students can say or do whatever they want. Often administrators or school personnel might push back on student voice initiatives thinking, well, we can't just let the students run the school on their own. We can't just take everything they have to say and change our whole school based on that. And I understand that. But that's why student voice means that there is an authentic and meaningful partnership between adults and students, where the goal is to be intentional about creating positive change. So again, there's that word intentional. We always want student voice to be intentional to make systemic change. But what's important is that student voice means that adults and students are working together to see what they can do together to make systemic change. Where typically what happens is that it's only the adults looking at what change needs to occur. So at the top here, you can actually see a research study done by researcher Petro Kubi in 2014 that discusses how important youth-adult partnerships are. So as you can see here, this researcher's study shows that when youth and adults have the equal amount of contributions to some kind of collective action or mutual learning, that's when we create thriving schools and communities. It's when you have equal contributions between the two. Where unfortunately what usually happens is we'll have about 90% adult contributions and 10% youth contributions, or 100% adult contributions and 0% youth contributions. But we need an equal share of both, working together collectively in order to create these thriving schools and communities. There's 4 core principles that this researcher discusses when talking about how to make youth-adult partnerships work. Number 1, you have to have authentic decision-making with both parties. So an example of this would be, for example, if you have a student on a board and the student is asked to give feedback on some improvements, however, the student doesn't actually have any voting privileges, then that's asking them for their feedback, but that's not actually giving them any kind of decision-making authority. Number 2 is that we need adults who are natural mentors. The adults that do well working on student voice initiatives and the schools that do well on student voice initiatives are the ones that have adults that truly care about this work. Please do not put anyone in a role of a student voice administrator or coordinator or even a youth advisory board leader if they do not truly care about this work. They need to be someone that's a natural mentor to students. Now, number 3 and number 4 are reciprocity and community connectedness. So, some things to consider at your district would be the following. When you're trying to evaluate, do we actually incorporate any student voice initiatives yet? And are we ready to? So these are things that you can go back and talk about with your groups if you decide to at your schools or your districts. But considering these and brainstorming over these may help you figure out where you really are on this plane. So number 1, to what degree do youth or students have the authority to make decisions that matter to themselves and others? And this question can be utilized at the district level or the school site level. Number 2, what are some settings in which youth work alongside adults who share their interests? Again, this could be at the district level or the school site level. Number 3, how are students and adults learning from each other? Number 4, how do we, as educators or school administrators, foster a sense of belonging with our students? And then number 5, how are we helping young people or students feel like they have a role to play in our entire community? What's important about the last question is even though student voice initiatives are focused on schools and districts, if we do them right and we let our students feel a sense of voice, it will make an impact on our community, our entire community, especially as our students get older and are able to advocate on behalf of the whole community. So what's so important about youth-adult partnerships? There are 3 different real reasons why you should invest in youth-adult partnerships, which we talked about the research behind earlier. Number 1 is social justice. Number 2 is that it truly does strengthen a democratic society. And then number 3, which is what a lot of us are looking at, is it engages our students and it gives them a sense of purpose and it helps retain them. Number 3 is the most important when we're talking about our homeless students. We need our homeless students to be engaged, feel a sense of agency over their educational futures, and we want to retain them in school. We want them to stop dropping out. We want them to stop being chronically absent, and we want them to succeed and eventually go to post-secondary education. Here's another study from a researcher named Bolstand in 2011 that discusses how, on this chart, it shows how on the right we have our conventional quote unquote school culture. And on the left, this is how we can change things to make it look more like a youth-adult partnership. So I've pointed out 2 areas of this, which I feel are the most important regarding student voice. So under the relationships line, you can see that when we're looking at youth-adult partnership approach in a school setting, we are looking at adults and young people as partners with different expertise. All partners are not quote unquote equal, as in identical, but everyone has something to contribute. And then I also want to point out at the bottom of the screen, core purpose. And this line says, under a youth-adult partnership approach, the developing students' capabilities, knowledge, and experience in the context of a project where students are leaders and change makers, addressing problems within their schools or addressing the challenge of getting quote-unquote student voice into educational decision-making, or addressing some other social justice or community or youth-related challenge. We discussed tokenism a little bit, but we also need to make sure that we're watching out for adultism. So adultism describes the systems of privileged attitudes and behaviors that adults have over those of young people. We often fall into this accidentally. As adults, we feel as though we're trying to incorporate student voice and we're trying to listen to students. But if we are still focused on the fact that adults' voices are more important, so they should have more say over the youth instead of putting a 50-50 percentile contribution, then we're falling under adultism as well, because we're still saying that adults' voices and opinions matter more than that of youth. Adultism shows up in many different places where we might not expect it. So adultism can show up in internalized adultism, which is the way we're all affected by adultism. So this would be things that we're taught growing up and we've internalized within ourselves. So as youth, we might have internalized that adults' opinions do matter more than our own, and they know better than we do, even though we have our own expertise. And as we grow into adults, we keep that internalized adultism within ourselves. There's also institutionalized adultism, which is the way we use laws, rules, and policies to inflict and sustain adultism. So those are things within the institution themselves. Rules, regulations that allow for adults to make almost 100% decision-making authority instead of incorporating that of students. Policies and procedures are important to look at to make sure that your policies and procedures do not include institutionalized adultism. And then number 3, it also shows up in cultural adultism, which is the way all adults affect adultism, either consciously or otherwise. So our culture has taught us how we should look at adultism, and our culture has also taught a lot of us to internalize adultism. This is a great quote by Michael Phelan, who was an educator in 1991. And it's something to pause and just really take note of. His quote says, "Imagine if we treated students as people whose opinion mattered." I'm going to read that one more time and give everyone a moment to pause and think about it. Imagine if we treated students as people whose opinion mattered. All right, so now we'll move into what research says about student voice initiatives. There's a very important study that was done by two researchers, Mitra and Gross, in 2009, and they created what's called the pyramid of student voice, which you can see on the left-hand side of the screen. Mitra and Gross's study shows that it's important to make sure that we are going up this leadership pyramid. And so at the bottom of the pyramid, we want all students to feel like they're being heard. So being heard would be school personnel acknowledging that youth have unique and important perspectives. That would be a baseline. We want this in every single school, and we want every single student in the school to be able to feel as though they're being heard. That can be in the classroom, that could be at the district level, but an educator within the classroom can also make this happen for students. Now, we then want a smaller group of students to collaborate with adults. This would be students and staff working together to improve their school through action. So as we're talking about homeless students, this is where, for example, youth advisory boards can fall under this part of the pyramid. Once we have youth advisory boards working, including homeless students and adults together, and they start collaborating with adults to improve their students to improve their schools through some kind of action, such as projects or town halls, etc., then we're rising up on the pyramid. If you'd like to know more about youth advisory boards, there's another section on the www.kern.org/HIP website where there is a mini training and supplemental information about youth advisory boards. Then, if we have a solid group of students who has been collaborating with adults, we then want to bring them to the top level, which is the most important, which is building those students up as leaders. We do not want this to end with collaborating with adults. We want to actually build our students into mini civic leaders. So building capacity for leadership really means that youth partner with adults and provide opportunities for civic development. It is our role as educators and as adult supporters to build our students into being mini leaders. As you can see on the right, there's a couple important parts of this. We want to systematically share leadership with youth to open up opportunities to re-engage disenfranchised youth. That's a quote from Mitra and Gross. So what that means is that if we are not teaching our youth who have experienced extreme adversity, such as our homeless youth, leadership, then we're not actually opening opportunities up to them to make our communities more equitable and our schools more equitable. And at the very bottom, you can see as civic capacity and student voice integration increases, schools become more equitable. We have to build up our student voice leaders and in order to make our schools more equitable. We cannot just ask them for their opinion, but we actually have to take the extra steps to take these youth who have not had the same chances as some other youth, build them up as little leaders in our community, and that will start making our schools and our communities more equitable. If you'd like to see this full research study or the next research study, which I'll go over, on the www.kern.org/HIP website, there's a section that says Student Voice Research, and you can actually click and read the entire study. Another important recent study, which was done by the RAND Corporation in 2021, was the COVID Student Voice Study. So the RAND study showed that half of teachers and school leaders admitted to placing less emphasis on integrating any student voice during the pandemic, even if they had done so prior. And the opportunities for capturing student voice during virtual learning was highly diminished. So what that means is that the need for schools to implement and elevate student voice has become even more critical since the pandemic. Our schools are seeing what happened after the pandemic and how it's affected our students. By starting to reincorporate student voice into our schools, we can help make our students feel more engaged again. During the pandemic, our students not only had to learn how to do virtual learning alongside our educators, but they also maybe did not feel as though their voices were being heard. Because as you can see here, the RAND study shows that half of teachers and school leaders admitted to placing much less emphasis on integrating any student voice during the pandemic, even if they had done so prior. So we've talked a lot about what student voice is and the research behind it so far. Let's talk about why student voice is specifically important for McKinney-Vento students. In California, we are really having a lot of issues around keeping our homeless students in school and engaged. So you can see here per CDE or DataQuest, in the 2021 to 2022 school year in all of California, 46.1% of all school-age homeless children were chronically absent. That's almost half of all homeless children in California were chronically absent in school in the 2021 to 2022 school year. 73.3% of homeless high school seniors graduated. That means about a third of our seniors are not graduating, which are homeless students. And then 5.6% of homeless students were suspended, compared to only 3.2% of all students. So as you can see here, our McKinney-Vento students are not graduating. They're very chronically absent, and many of them are being suspended, leading to some of those chronic absences as well. So how can student voice initiatives help that data? Help improve that data? Student voice increases student engagement, the research says, lowering rates of chronic absenteeism and high school dropout rates. Student voice gives homeless youth a sense of agency over their personal lives and educational futures. And then when you use student voice increases academic motivation. Students who believe they have a voice in school are 7 times more likely to be academically motivated. So as you can see here, if we're utilizing student voice tactics, our engagement with students should be going up. We should see lower rates of chronic absenteeism and high school dropout rates among our homeless students. And we should see that our homeless students are much more likely to be academically motivated. Student voice is also trauma informed. So how is it trauma informed? Here's two quotes that get into that a little bit. So the Great Lakes Equity Center actually put out this quote, which says, "Without youth, school reform efforts are limited to adults' understandings of what counts as equity." And that's extremely important. We have to integrate student voice and student feedback in order to really reform our schools to make them equitable. Otherwise, you can see that our schools are only as equitable as our adults think they are, which might mean that our youth might not think that the schools are equitable at all, because we have much different ways and different lenses of looking at equity. And then the Association for Supervision and Curriculum Development has the following quote: "Encouraging students' voice and choice is essential for students living with adversity, such as our homeless students. as it allows them to be empowered and have control in matters that are relevant to their lives. We discussed this prior, but it's very, very important to make sure that our homeless students feel a sense of agency and empowerment over their educational futures. When they feel that way, which they can through student voice initiatives, then they will be much more engaged in school and much more successful in school. We're briefly going to watch a video of the Eastside Union High School District in partnership with UCLA Center for the Transformation of Schools. I touched on a quote from one of their student leaders, Lupe, earlier in the presentation, but I do believe that this was a well done video where it talks about youth power, voice, and participation at their school and how important student voice is. So please take a minute and watch this wonderful video with me.
We talk about wanting students to take ownership of their education and take responsibility for their futures. And then we don't give them any ability to really have that true ownership and responsibility.
Every issue talked about at the school district level directly impacts us. And for so long, for so many years, our voices have just been brushed aside.
How did the work of empowering young people in Eastside begin? It began with young people. And as adults, we tried for a long time to address the issues that we thought students were having, and were running into roadblocks, challenges, not getting the results we were wanting to. And then we started listening to students.
I think frequently in high schools, students play a role of running activities. And very rarely do we see students in roles of deciding what the curriculum should be or what kind of instruction should happen in a classroom or how a school budget should be spent. Yet students are the ones that are the recipients of how we spend that money. So it's critical for us to empower students, help them learn how to share their voice, create mechanisms for them to have leverage on power.
When I got on the board, the first question I asked myself was, how do I know the impact on students for all the votes that I take? And I thought the best way to know is to hear from them.
I feel like the only way students are gonna feel like they matter or like they take up positive space is if that reflects back in the classroom. And then from there, it just like blooms into like a bigger inspiration, and blooms into bigger changes, moving your way up, not just in the classroom, but maybe at rallies, or not just at rallies, but now maybe you're volunteering places in your communities, and maybe you're now at the district helping out. And I think that it all like blossoms from the classrooms and from the teachers and the staff. And that's definitely why I'm super thankful that I had positive relationships with like the staff at my school, and we're there, like the values they held were being reflected in the classroom, and we're definitely empowering us like as students and as youth.
I remember many principals saying, you probably don't want Californians for Justice on your campus. They're going to be disruptive. And then when I talked to them for the first time, I said, that's the kind of disruptive that we need, for them to leverage student voice in a way that is more than performative, for them to bring that voice to us at the school, to the next level up at our district office and beyond to the state, in a way that me as part of the institution, I just can't do.
I think the structure and culture that we were trying to build was not doing to young people, as adults to youth, not doing for young people, a lot of, savior complex, but actually doing with young people. And so that idea of true collaboration, of co-creation, that's what we were trying to demonstrate.
Student voice in Eastside is not just self-expression, it's not just for fun, it's not to give somebody a turn. It's welcoming students as a contributor and a collaborator to their school culture, their school climate, and the outcomes that they want to see.
When Californians for Justice came into our district, that really kind of like turn things around. And I think that also in turn empowered so many students to be more involved in their communities. You know, we just brought up issues that the district hasn't even thought about, from mental health resources to making sure that students are being prepared for college, making sure that students are being welcomed in their school spaces, and that we're making racial justice a priority and including that into everything we do as a district.
And I want to see that happen not only in CFJ, not only in my classroom, but also at the district level. As a student, as parents, or like as a community member, I want to be able to walk into the district and feel like I can create a positive relationship with the people at the district, feel safe and feel vulnerable with them.
There are a lot of assumptions when you give young people power that, you know, they're going to want to plan a bunch of ice cream socials with that, you know, power, that money, for example.
Over and over again, when we entrust people with power, we see them live up to the potential and really better align how they're spending that school budget on the things that are most important to them.
I think when you talk about empowering student voice, that means empowering the voices of students of color, the voices of low-income students. And so once again, like, because we have been like historically marginalized and our voices like have been put aside for so long, now that it's our opportunity to speak, we want to use that as a power for good.
My belief in the purpose of education is to change individual lives so that they have full access to the future. And in so doing, on a macro level, changing hundreds of students' lives so that they can take with them who they are, their strengths, into the world, empowered by education to make our society what it needs to be, not what it currently is.
The key to making change is building positive relationships with everyone, with students, parents, the communities, people at the district, and not only giving power to the students and the community, but empowering them.
When we listen and include student voice, we're much better able to positively respond. It's going to be very challenging for our students for full participation later in life if they can't be full participants in their high school experience.
It gives me hope for what the future of our society could be. Every one of those young leaders who finds their voice and power is able to fan the flames for hundreds of others, and that becomes a lifelong gift to our communities and our society.
We talk about wanting students to take ownership of their education.
Within that video, we saw them also discuss how student voice equals empowerment. So trauma-informed schools empower students with trauma to share their thoughts and experiences with school policymakers, administrators, and teachers. The empowerment process can impact students by promoting individual and social development, demonstrating the importance of student rights, promoting youth connection, increasing confidence, and enhancing decision-making skills. Using an empowerment perspective to address problems within the school means to create opportunities for collaboration with students, encourage students to identify what problems exist, and including youth voice in creating solutions and taking action. So now that we've discussed some of what student voice is, the research behind student voice, how student voice helps homeless students, and how it's trauma informed, let's talk about some project examples. On the www.kern.org/HIP website, there is a tab that says Student Voice Idea Menus. Our program developed these idea menus, and they are broken into low effort ideas, medium effort ideas, and high effort ideas that you can utilize on your school site or at your district. Every school site or district should be able to at least implement a low effort idea. These would be student voice projects that you can implement if you are lacking a lot of resources or funding or staff time. However, of course, as you go up through medium effort to high effort, the high effort ideas are going to give you the most impact on your school climate, your district climate, on the engagement of homeless students, etc. So we do encourage you to try to utilize some of the medium or high effort student voice project ideas. However, at the very least, every school site or district should be able to implement a low effort idea. It's also important to know that the student voice idea menus are meant to be a baseline. And just to give you ideas, they're not meant to be an exhaustive list of all student voice projects or initiatives that can be implemented at school sites or districts. They're just meant to be a small sample of possible student voice projects that you can utilize to get started. Some other student voice ideas you could utilize in the in middle school classrooms or high school classrooms are as follows. And these are suggestions actually by Arizona State University's student voice, elevating student voice and choice at the course level program. There's pathways of engagement, which allows students to move through your classroom in a choose your own adventure style, having them choose different options to help them create change in their own learning path. Within the classroom, you can also do choice of lens, which is that students choose the perspective from which they want to view the week's topic. Another one educators could use within the classroom is choice of grade. So students actually choose the grade that they want and participate accordingly. There are A, B, C, etc. assignment options. Students are expected to be successful at the C assignment, but are given time to tackle harder parts of these assignments to complete B level and A level parts of the assignment. Students can choose how much work and time they want to invest in their education. Something like choice of grade is not something we might typically think to promote, only because we, of course, always want our students to excel and get A's. But it might be something to consider when working with homeless students that are struggling from going from housing placement to housing placement, or often having to not know if they're going to get to school, how they're going to get food, etc. Choice of extras is another opportunity that an educator could use in the classroom, which would be that students receive opportunities to receive extra credit or perks. And then another one, which is also very helpful for our homeless students, is flexible deadlines. This allows students to have flexible assignment deadlines, which may help them succeed. This strategy is especially helpful for students dealing with trauma or multiple responsibilities, such as our homeless students or our foster students. Some other student voice projects that could be utilized within the classroom itself are giving a lecture. This would be to create a lesson plan or lecture for a day that allows students to deliver the content in different ways that make sense to them. Topic choice, students decide what topics to explore within the concept of the course. Student-led discussion groups. So these would be discussion groups where students are co-facilitators to engage student discussion. Students ask questions in their discussions and the co-facilitators answer the questions, make comments, and ask questions. And then another one, which is also very helpful for our homeless students, is to drop a lowest score. This gives students the option to drop their lowest assignment, which will give them flexibility in the course and allow them to recover if they have a quote unquote life event come up. For our homeless students, their life event is every day, but at least being able to drop the lowest score or the lowest 2 scores of different assignments may help them succeed in your classroom. There are also examples of student voice in elementary school classrooms. And some of those are as follows. You can begin your class with a welcoming ritual, having the students share what's on their mind to allow them to release their current thoughts and be present. Being consistent is very important, making sure that you're speaking in front of the class, writing on the board, having choices regarding what work the students are working on. Ask the students for their feedback and then actually utilize that. This helps show students their voices do have power at a young age. And then most importantly is to show that you care. Students that feel like they are cared for and engaged with school are more likely to speak their truth. Now, these are the types of systemic change examples that we like to see. So within an elementary school, these are different types of student voice projects that can be utilized on a school-wide level or on a district level. So in the elementary school realm, you could create a student council, but make sure that if you're going to create a student council, the student council is diverse. You have to be intentional about making sure that your elementary student council has very reliable adult supporters and that you're intentional about incorporating homeless students within that student council. And then utilize the adult supporters to actually make sure that the homeless youth are speaking up and that their voices are also being acknowledged by the other students. But of course, please don't shout out who a homeless student is. We don't want to out them to their peers. Another project example to make systemic change would be that students at an elementary school can partner with the PTA if you have one. Allow these students to help plan school-wide events alongside parent volunteers. The students can also present to the parent volunteers about what they're learning in the classroom. This is actually also listed on our low effort idea menu for our student voice project menus. And the reason why it's listed on low effort is because it's low effort for school staff. It might be more high effort for parent volunteers in the PTA, but for school staff, it's low effort because it's really just about connecting the parent volunteers with the students. Another low effort idea, which is listed here for elementary school students, is to use a feedback box. So you can place a feedback box in an area that all students can access, allow them to write suggestions on pieces of paper and submit them to the box anonymously. But what's the most critical about this is that you have to be intentional about reviewing the feedback provided in the box, utilizing that feedback and discussing it among administrators to see if systemic change needs to happen. And then you have to close the feedback loop. The feedback box will fail if no one goes back to the students and explains how their input was utilized, or if it wasn't utilized, why it couldn't be utilized. Oftentimes we lose our student voice initiative momentum because no one is following up with the students. So if they continue to submit feedback to a box and never hear anything back about it, they're going to stop doing it. So someone has to at least reach out to the student body and explain what feedback was looked at and why it was used or why it couldn't be used. And then on an elementary school level, you can create a student voice team. Include adults and students from campus to discuss things that are going well and where there's room for improvement, and make a plan together. This falls directly under youth-adult partnerships, which is critical for student voice initiatives to actually make systemic change. At the district level, or if you're within a COE, these are some options that you have. So another thing you could do is some districts have chosen to hire a position called a student voice coordinator. So for example, in the Washoe County School District, which is in Reno, Nevada, they do have a student voice coordinator paid staff position. That staff position ensures that student voice is utilized by LEAs to help make their school sites more trauma informed. Another thing that either a district could do or even a COE is to hold student town halls. So this would be listening to feedback from students in a public forum. And what's very, very critical about these student town halls, however, is to make sure that homeless students are specifically invited to these and that their voices are heard. Again, we don't want to out them to their peers and identify them as being a homeless student, but our McKinney-Vento liaisons can be intentional about making sure that these students are invited. And then another really important option would be to put a student on your school board. So students on school boards are one way to give students decision-making power. However, it is critical that if the students on the board, they have voting privileges. And this is important because of what we looked at about youth-adult partnerships. The students cannot just be asked to provide feedback. They need to actually have some kind of decision-making authority. And it's recommended that if you do put a student on your school board, that student represents subgroups of students that are not usually heard, such as putting a homeless student on your school board or a student who has experienced homelessness in the past and can speak on that perspective. Some other student voice ideas at the district level are as follows. You can do student surveys, create youth advisory boards, hire adult supporters that will promote authentic student voice. You can do student voice through art, such as photojournalism. On the www.kern.org/HIP website, under the Student Voice and Multimedia tab, you can see how you can create a podcast or do a photojournalism project through art and utilize student voice to do so. You can give students decision-making authority, host focus groups with homeless students, and you can create a student governing board. So now that you've learned all about student voice, what do you do next? You need to create your own roadmap for your LEA or your school site. When you're creating your student voice project startup plan, you need to learn, which is what we did in this video. Then you need to choose a project that you want to work on. You need to develop your project. You need to conduct your project. And then you need to take action, including evaluating that project. We reviewed this again, the student voice idea menus, but it's very important that when you're looking at a project, you just begin with an idea. So you want to select a student voice project that helps benefit homeless students. You can utilize one of our student voice idea menus. You can utilize one of the other projects that I just reviewed in the last few slides. But you also want to utilize your local LEA data regarding academics, attendance, and school climate to determine what project may be most appropriate for your school. Now, after you've decided on your project idea, you need to actually outline your whole project. On www.kern.org/HIP, under the Student Voice Evaluation Tools tab, you'll see the document which has the front page on this slide. It's called Kickstarting Your Student Voice Project. If you go through that entire toolkit, it will help you outline and create your entire project. It'll help you develop the project background, the scope of the project, required resources, student involvement, monitoring and evaluation plan, youth involvement, and project summary. This is the page within that toolkit that provides project background. So you look at what's the big picture. You'll provide some context about the project. What is the vision of your project? How do you want the lives of your students and your school to be different because of youth involved in your project? And explain why you have chosen this to respond to a set of issues, such as chronic absenteeism, high school dropout rates, etc. Number 2, you'll look through the scope of the project. So what are you going to do as a part of the project? You'll describe the what and the how of the project, give an overview of the activities involved, and you want to be specific and use SMART objectives, but you don't want to get lost in detail. Number 3, you'll look at the required resources. What do you need? You'll list your resources and support, external and internal, that you'll need to complete the project. Try to be as realistic and detailed as possible. And some things that this could include could be, what people do you have on board? What training do you need to provide? What physical and virtual space do you have? What supplies do you need? What funding do you need or do you have? Do you need food or student initiatives and incentives for different projects, etc.? Then you'll move on to student involvement. So how will you gather diverse student views and opinions? What is your recruitment plan and what role will they play? How will you engage students continuously throughout the project? Will you offer them incentives? Will you provide them training? And how will you close the feedback loop? We discussed this earlier. You have to let students know that their voices are being heard. And if for some reason you can't utilize the feedback that they provided to make change, you need to explain to them why not. Then you'll move into your monitoring and evaluation plan. We always want to be looking at data to see how things are working. So how are you going to document what you're doing and measure your outcomes? Are you going to use surveys, focus groups, interviews, school data, etc.? What process measures and outcome measures are you going to utilize? How are you going to share the results, and who are you going to share the results with? How will you monitor the quality and improve your program? And how will you involve students in evaluation and use of results? And then you're going to do your project summary, which is putting it all together. So now that you've generated some ideas and prioritized action items, it would be time to develop a specific action plan. And an action plan provides a clear picture of the entire Student Voice project, its goals, and how all activities fit together to achieve those goals, similar to SMART goals. So now that you have received a lot of basic information on Student Voice projects and ideas, you should be able to get started. But if you need more individual coaching on Student Voice basics or how to get started at your LEA, your COE, or your school site, please feel free to email us at fosteredcoordinator@kern.org. And I highly recommend checking out the www.kern.org/HIP website for more advanced Student Voice trainings. Select the different tabs and you'll see trainings within specific elements of Student Voice, which can help move your project forward. Thank you.